It was a warm summer evening when Emily and her friends decided to visit a remote beach, one they had never heard of before. It wasn't on any maps, no tourist signs, no bustling shops or crowded shores, just an untouched piece of coastline that Emily's friend Jason claimed he had stumbled upon during a hike the week before. "That's the best part," Jason had said with excitement. "No one knows about it." Intrigued by the promise of seclusion, Emily, Jason, and their friends Sarah and Mike packed their bags and set out in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when they arrived. The beach was breathtaking, soft, white sand, gentle waves rolling onto the shore, and not another soul in sight. A perfect paradise. As they set up their spot on the sand, the group noticed something odd. Scattered all around the beach were large, smooth stones. They were placed in strange patterns, circles, spirals, and lines leading toward the water. They looked unnatural, almost deliberate, but Jason shrugged it off. "Probably some weird art project," he said, laughing. "People are always doing strange stuff in remote places like this." Emily, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt different here, heavier somehow. There was a stillness, a kind of silence she couldn't explain. Even the usual sounds of the ocean seemed muted, distant. As night fell, they lit a small fire and began to relax, telling stories and laughing. But the sense of unease never left Emily. She noticed that the stones around them seemed to catch the firelight in strange ways, as if they were subtly shifting positions when no one was looking. Suddenly, Sarah stood up. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tense. The others fell silent. In the distance above the sound of the waves, there was a faint noise like whispering. It was low and rhythmic, carried on the breeze. "Probably just the wind," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. But the whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if it was coming closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around and noticed that the strange stone patterns on the beach seemed to pulse in the firelight, as though the stones themselves were alive. "I think we should leave," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. Jason scoffed, but then they all saw it, something moving at the edge of the water. A dark figure slowly rising from the waves. It wasn't human. Its shape was twisted and wrong, its skin pale and wet, dripping with seawater. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as the figure moved closer. The group froze in terror as more figures emerged from the ocean, all with the same grotesque, watery appearance. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words that none of them could understand, but somehow felt ancient, cursed. Sarah screamed, and that was enough to break the spell. "Run!" Jason shouted, and they all scrambled to their feet, sprinting toward the car parked behind the dunes. But as they ran, Emily realized something horrifying. The stones. They weren't just patterns. They were markers, boundaries, and they had crossed into something's territory. The figures from the sea were gaining on them, gliding across the sand as if they weren't bound by the same rules of gravity. Emily could feel their cold presence behind her, the whispering now deafening in her ears. They reached the car and piled in, slamming the doors just as one of the figures reached for the handle. Jason floored the gas pedal, and they sped away, the figures receding into the darkness behind them. Breathing heavily, the group didn't speak for a long time. It wasn't until they were miles away, back on the main road, that Mike finally broke the silence. What the hell were those things?" No one had an answer. The next day, they tried to find the beach again. Jason insisted it had to be on the map somewhere. But no matter how hard they looked, they couldn't find it. It was as if the beach had never existed. Weeks later, Emily received a postcard in the mail. It was a picture of a serene beach, just like the one they had visited. But on the back, there was no message. Only one line, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "You can't escape." The postcard smelled faintly of salt water.
My best friend Ricardo and I were 19. At the risk of sounding pretentious, the two of us come from well-off North Jersey families and get to enjoy our summers down the Jersey Shore. My house is in Belmar, New Jersey, and his is in La Valette. It was a random summer night during the week, and Ricardo was driving the two of us from my house in Belmar down to La Valette, about an hour drive. To be completely honest, I preferred hanging out in Ricardo's house, not only because it was a little nicer, but because the general vibe of La Valette is more geared towards kids our age. If we weren't scouring the area for a party, we could enjoy some drinks on one of the many private beaches we technically weren't supposed to be on. I could go on and on about things to do down the shore, but for the sake of brevity, I'll try my best to get to the point. As we were driving down, we agreed that we'd opt for a quieter night. No partying, links, or anything that we might normally do. The two of us agreed to snag a few beers, roll a joint, and chill on one of the private beaches under the stars. Honestly, it sounded great. The two of us had been going pretty hard with some of our other friends. A break from partying was much needed. To anyone unfamiliar with the layout of La Valette, there's a beach side and a bay side. Most of the beaches feature a really high dune and a steep drop-off as you approach the ocean. If you were to stand at the ocean edge and look back, you'd see a pretty sizable hill of sand. After drinking a few drinks at Ricardo's place, we snagged some bikes from his garage and made our way toward the beach of our choice. For whatever reason, Ricardo insisted on journeying further than I'd ever been, which I didn't quite understand since all the beaches were basically the same. I really didn't mind a longer bike ride though, so I just went with it. Eventually, Ricardo decided on a desolate-looking beach at the end of the road with no cars parked on it. Every house on the street had its lights off. I actually preferred this. This was back when weed was illegal in New Jersey, and we weren't too keen on getting caught. Plus, we did have some drinks with us despite the fact that we were only 19. We hid our bikes under some shrubs. Then we made our way toward the beach. The two of us lit our J and smoked under the stars, the only sound being the light waves of the ocean and the accompanying wind. The beach stretched on endlessly in both directions, and the sand felt cool underneath our feet. The two of us got progressively drunker while we filled the air with laughter and conversation. Eventually, we just laid back in the sand, watching a sky full of stars in hopes of witnessing a shooting star. That's when we heard it. I heard it first. It was almost undetectable. The sound was like a metallic buzzing, sort of like the sound you'd hear in a massive gymnasium with large overhead lights. I really can't describe the sound any better. It was a faint, metallic buzz that couldn't possibly be anything caused by the beach. I sat up and stared at Ricardo, and I could tell the moment he started to hear it too. The two of us whipped our heads in every direction, looking into the darkness for the source of the drone. Strangely, it was difficult to pin down exactly where the sound was coming from. It was just too faint to tell. We were beginning to get freaked out, but were too terrified to move. We assumed that whatever was making that noise would go away, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. There was literally no way we could be seen from our spot on that beach. It was way too dark, and the sound of the ocean definitely drowned out any sounds we had been making. I know it doesn't exactly sound scary, but I'd be lying if I said my heart wasn't pounding out of my chest. The drone continued on, and after another few minutes, Ricardo gestured for me to follow him. I nodded my head in agreement. Leaving was definitely the best option. Just like a scene from a movie, the exact second the two of us stood up, the droning went from a 1 to a 5. It took every ounce of self-control I had to resist the urge to yell in fear. It wasn't a gradual shift. The sound literally increased in a split second, and it was definitely coming from our right. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and a wave of fear washed over me, tensing my body from head to toe. We stared into the darkness and still didn't see anything. But now the drone sounded so close to us that we instinctively started running toward the sand dune. I didn't even know what we were running from. All I knew was that something was seriously wrong and there was someone or something after us. As we were about halfway to the dune, I felt Ricardo place a firm hand on my shoulder, abruptly stopping me from continuing to run. At first, I was confused, but then I saw what his gaze was fixated on. I glanced up toward the dune and saw it. There was a dark figure standing motionlessly at the peak of the dune. Its arms were freakishly long, almost reaching its knees. It was ridiculously tall, and I was shocked at how it managed to stand so still. It was truly terrifying. Ricardo shouted at me, breaking my gaze from the figure, and we continued running, this time parallel to the beach. We ran to the next dune entrance and sprinted up the slope. As we made our way to the peak, we looked back at where we had just came from. I can still remember the terrifying sight that followed. Not only was the dark figure still on the dune, but there were maybe 3 or 4 more standing motionless on the slope. Each one looked like they were facing us. We didn't have time to go back for our bikes, instead opting to run the entire way home. The next morning, We retraced our steps, but couldn't for the lives of us find those bikes. Maybe they had been stolen, or maybe whoever or whatever was stalking us the night before had something to do with it. Either way, I've never experienced anything scarier on a beach and still have trouble explaining most of these events. The weirdest thing for me is I was never able to determine what the buzzing drone was, and to this day, have not heard anything even remotely close to it.